Désolé, j'ai juste le machin qui vient. Désolé, le micro.
Mesdames et messieurs, bonjour. Merci d'être présents en ligne aujourd'hui avec nous. Au nom du Club suisse de la presse et de son directeur Pierucci, je vous souhaite la bienvenue pour ce débat. Je souhaite également la bienvenue à nos trois intervenants éminents qui vont s'exprimer en anglais. I welcome you, Mr. Richard Samans. You are director at the research department at the ILO. Good morning, and thank you for being with us. Good morning, Mr. Richard Kozul-Wright. You are a director at the Department of Globalization and Development Strategy of UNCTAD. Good morning to you. And good morning, Madame Vesselina Ratcheva. You are a researcher at the Insight Lead at the World Economic Forum. Good morning, everybody. The COVID has been devastating for labor everywhere in the world. So how to revive the labor market and avoid a north-south confrontation? Mr. Samans, the ILO will launch next week a very important report. Can you tell us more about this question? How to revive the labor market and avoid a north-south confrontation?
Alors, merci beaucoup, madame. Je vais commencer en français peut-être et utiliser ma langue maternelle plus tard.
Avec plaisir.
Bon, juste d'abord, quelques pensées. En fait, c'est vrai, la semaine prochaine, on va lancer notre rapport annuel. Ça, c'est notre véhicule principal pour regarder le monde du travail et d'avoir quelques calculations concernant qu'est-ce qui s'est passé dans l'année précédente. Bien entendu, l'année précédente était inédite en fait dans notre métier. Il faut dire que pour l'avenir, pour 2021, on aura des perspectives, mais il faut dire que pour l'instant, il paraît que la reprise économique est fragile et nettement hétérogène. Il y a des inégalités socio-économiques profondes et ça risque de durer longtemps. Et surtout, il y a des groupes qui étaient le plus touchés par la crise, c'est-à-dire les jeunes, tout d'abord, aussi des femmes, aussi des travailleurs informels, les travailleurs avec des capacités moins sophistiquées, disons. Tous ces groupes étaient plus touchés que les autres, que les gens comme nous peut-être, qui peuvent travailler depuis nos maisons, etc. Donc, il y a un tel risque d'une baisse long terme de la croissance potentielle de nos économies et aussi des inégalités dans nos sociétés. Même avant la crise, il y avait toutes sortes de débats concernant le niveau des inégalités dans notre société, dans le monde du travail. Et c'est vrai que maintenant, même s'il faut voir la reprise du PIB, c'est très important en fait. C'est le moteur pour le développement. Mais ce n'est pas la même chose que le développement en fait. Donc, il ne faut pas être satisfait de voir simplement, même si c'est important, une reprise de PIB. Afin d'adresser des inégalités qui se creusent même plus profondément dans la crise pandémique, il faut avoir des politiques directes et fortes est bien élaboré d'amener les groupes comme ça avec nous, avec la société en général. On dit ça au BIT, Human-Centered Recovery, une reprise focalisée sur l'être humain, qui favorise surtout l'emploi productif et la sécurité sociale. Ici en Suisse, il y avait une réponse, une inter-réponse de politique dans cette direction dans les derniers quelques mois, même dans tout 2020. Et je veux dire tout d'abord, comme réponse de votre question, madame, qu'il ne faut pas oublier ça, il faut continuer dans cette direction. Il faut de plus avoir une réponse similaire sur le plan de coopération internationale. Parce que même si dans les sociétés, il y a des inégalités qui continuent à approfondir, c'est le même cas dans l'économie mondiale. Il y a des écarts qui s'élargissent, en fait. Ils s'élargissent parmi des pays. Et peut-être plus tard, je peux offrir quelques pensées concernant quelles sont les politiques de la coopération internationale qu'il faut avoir dans la même direction que je parle ici, c'est-à-dire pour une reprise focalisée sur l'être humain. Mais pour l'instant, je veux simplement dire que ça, c'est important. Il faut, même si la politique macroéconomique est très importante, dans cette situation, il faut avoir tous les deux comme perspective macroéconomique, mais aussi beaucoup d'efforts de politique sur les domaines de politique structurelle, c'est-à-dire en ce qui concerne les marchés de travail, en ce qui concerne la sécurité sociale, etc. Merci beaucoup.
Merci à vous, Monsieur Samans. Monsieur Richard Kozul-Wright, Mr. Samans mentioned that strong politics are needed. Where do you see the priority in order to have strong politics? Hello, I don't hear you.
Sorry, I mean, where we really need strong politics is in the advanced economies. I mean, that's essentially where the problem lies here. The simple explanations of why you have a crisis in northern labor markets is either because of increased trade, competition with low wage economies, outsourcing, offshoring that has gone along with that story, and there's some evidence for that, or technology, automation, more capital-intensive production, loss of all kinds of jobs, both low-skilled and increasingly the fear is white-collar jobs of one kind or another. The problem with these theories, it's not that they're wrong, they're just misguided, essentially. The problem of northern labor markets come from a series of interactive factors that predate the rise of China. And most of the story when it comes to trade versus technology ultimately reduces to a China story. So the problem for the West is that China has become too economically and politically powerful, and that has all the negative reverberations in northern labor markets. It's simply not true, right? I mean, the problem with advanced economies is a set of policies and a growth dynamic based around finance and increasingly monopolized markets that simply can't generate the kind of high-paid jobs that are required to replace the low-skilled, lower-paying jobs that the North has traditionally done as part of its own economic dynamic. Far more jobs were lost in the 1960s and the 1970s in the advanced economies than are being lost today. It's just that the advanced economies were growing quickly The benefits of productivity growth were being widely shared. Wages were on a steady increase during that period. Investment was very high, both public and private, essentially because a kind of rapacious form of finance capital was being heavily regulated, not perfectly, but heavily regulated. And all those conditions of a healthy economy in the advanced economies, which have nothing to do with what's going on in the developing world, we would argue that many of the developing countries suffer from those same financialized pressures that advanced economies do. But until we address those underlying structural problems of insufficient investment, overly concentrated markets, predatory corporate behavior, low wage, low productivity growth, then I think the danger is that we will have these endless tensions between advanced and developing countries. And I think the root cause of that, ultimately, or the root solution to that, lies with a better politics in the advanced economies.
Can you tell us what UNCTAD is suggesting in order to avoid that?
Well, I mean, we can go back to that later. I mean, obviously, interestingly, the kinds of policies to some extent that Biden has begun to follow in the United States, far more expansionary macroeconomic policies, are willing to talk about industrial policy to some extent, but not sufficiently, the need to address the problem of highly monopolized markets through stronger antitrust legislation, all these things that have come back in the US under the Biden administration, some of them practically, some of them in terms of the discussion within the administration, are the kinds of policies we need to see more generally. Certainly, the Europeans are not following this route. The Europeans have stuck, even during COVID-19, to a far more predictable policy playbook that in a sense, has replicated a kind of neoliberal agenda. So that at the domestic level, it's a kind of, I think we should take some happiness from what Biden is doing, but the international agenda, which I guess you want to talk about later, is another issue again, and UNCTAD has far more concerns where it comes to what's going on in terms of the multilateral agenda, where the failure to make necessary reforms, despite the shock of COVID, I think is something that we find very difficult to swallow.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much. Mrs. Ratcheva, may I ask you to share with us the views of the World Economic Forum and your views on this question?
Thank you. So one of the things we've been tracking for a number of years now, around 5 years, has been how jobs are changing in the current context. And that's been in parallel with understanding how that's going to impact gender parity. Are we prepared to face this challenge through adequate reskilling and upskilling? Do we have the systems in place to do this for the current generations at work, but also for future generations at work? And what we've sadly seen in the context of the current pandemic is what Rick so rightly pointed out at the very beginning, which is that existing inequalities have been hit harder than along those fracture lines. We've seen further split and a divergence between those who are already probably not in a very good situation, and it's gotten worse. One aspect that we just pointed out in our Global Gender Gap report released in March was just how much we're seeing a falling back on gender parity. All the data is not in, but some fast-moving indicators are showing up that the hiring of women into leadership positions has slowed down. And what is the cause there? It's not very hard to tell. In many places, we've had school establishments close or close partially. It's still not back to normal. And already we had an unequal sharing of that care responsibility in the household. So women have actually fallen back out of the labor market in a lot of contexts. And this is especially the case in a lot of economies in Latin America. We're seeing that very clearly in the data, but we've seen it also in other economies. We're also not prepared to step up in these challenges. We've seen the investments in the care economy, investments in education, in updating education systems so they fit for the future of work. Those haven't been on the table for a long time, and they're still not on the table in the recovery right now. And those are very large multiplier effect investments that can have dividends on job growth, but they can also have dividends on how humans can actually prosper in this new economy that's going to hopefully grow out of the current crisis. And the last thing there is we've had a really big step change in when people need to be upgraded in terms of skills. We used to make an investment early on in people's lives in the education system, mostly state funded, and that investment would last you for your whole career. That's no longer the case. Just by 2025, our survey of CHROs suggests that people's skills could need a significant investment. About 40% of people's skills need to be upgraded. And this is something that needs to happen as a step change within businesses, where that training budget that a business has to be reasonably big. And people have to be able to take on that challenge as well themselves in order to actually become lifelong learners. And that's a really big mind shift change. And we are seeing that businesses are telling us that they are thinking of changing the location of jobs that they currently have. So we really need to be in a position where everyone mid-career can find a way to upgrade those skills.
Thank you very much. Mr. Samans, je reviens vers vous. Vous avez mentionné que les jeunes sont en train de payer un lourd tribut par rapport au travail. Madame nous a vraiment expliqué que l'éducation avait été peut-être sous-estimée, l'importance de l'éducation avait été sous-estimée, l'éducation revient maintenant avec la santé, redevient une priorité absolument urgente. Que suggère l'OIT pour essayer de venir en aide à ces jeunes qui souffrent justement aujourd'hui de cette situation?
Merci de votre question. Je crois que je vais changer en anglais maintenant.
You're welcome, sir.
Okay. I mean, as you mentioned, and as I mentioned earlier, that, you know, no group has been more affected by this crisis than younger workers. We did a survey last year of a number of countries just to get a sense of exactly how significant this disproportionate burden has been on young people. And we found in 24 out of 33 countries that we surveyed, the share of people, young people, not in employment, education, or training had increased quite substantially. And also, you know, next week, as I mentioned, we'll be releasing our updated numbers for what happened in the world of work in many dimensions in 2020, as well as some projections for this year. And we'll have an important focus in that report on youth. And while I don't want to preview too much of what we will issue at that time, I can tell you that the employment rates of young workers fell a significant multiple more than those of adults during the pandemic. So we really had, if we before the crisis had a very significant youth employment problem that is spread across many countries. This is not solely an issue for countries in poverty, although it's acute there. This crisis has deepened that and really does risk longer term scars on our societies and our economies. You know, one point in that regard is that there is, you know, discussion in the medical community, in the health community, about what is known as long COVID. So recurrent or long-term effects, many of which were unforeseen at the time of the actual infection and illness to individuals from this COVID. Well, you know, this picture of disproportionate effects and in the absence of concerted effort by policymakers and by companies and other decision makers to try to address these differential effects as we recover from the crisis and to make sure that we're bringing as much of society along as possible, that risks a certain long COVID in a social and economic sense. It could, you know, to the extent that we leave a large share of our young population out of the job market or see their trajectory of earnings and skills acquisition lower vis-a-vis their older cohorts over time, that has a very concrete economic effect. That spells lower productivity, smaller labor force participation, and therefore lower growth and development potential of economies. So there is a real potential of scarring, as we call it, longer term effects from COVID if we don't pay attention to these differential effects in our recovery strategies. And indeed, we could be talking not just about long COVID in the medical sense, we could be talking and having quite a robust debate years from now about long COVID in this larger economic and social sense. Now, in terms of the policy responses, there are a number of things that ought to be done. But the larger point I want to make today, without getting into kind of a long sermon about very specific technical responses to individual parts of the labor market, is that these areas of worker protections, investment in worker capabilities, investment in worker transitions. So you see in advanced country markets where we are seeing some significant growth in employment, we're seeing a large unmet demand for employment and inefficiency in matching workers to opportunities, in part because of poor active labor market policies and institutional capability in that regard to help people find new jobs and to provide them with the necessary transitional income maintenance and other support, as well as just inattention to these longer term skilling needs of our young population and investment in school to work transitions, in tertiary education that has an application in the job market and the like. So bottom line in response to your question is that we need to rethink in policy terms the priority that is placed on investing in people, investing in the institutions of work, investing in the capabilities of people, their protections, their transitions, and investing in employment intensive areas of our economies which can provide productive employment for people. These domains of labor market and social protection have not been a central priority, I would say, in the growth and development model, the basic policy mental model of policymakers and politicians for the last several decades. And I think our colleague from UNCTAD was referring to that. Well, this is how we look at it. We think that these specific domains deserve to be reprioritized, placed at the center of economic growth and development policy, and indeed placed at the center of the way we're approaching the recovery from the pandemic crisis. And next week, the International Labor Conference of the ILO, our annual meeting of the ministers and the executives from the companies and the trade union leaders, will come together and have a big discussion about how to advance such a human-centered, broad-based recovery and what this reprioritization of these areas of policy means for governments and for other stakeholders in our societies. Thank you very much. Back to you.
Thank you very much. You have mentioned your colleague at UNCTAD, and I'm coming back to you, Mr. Kozul-Wright. How do you explain the fact that politicians, heads of states, international leaders have underestimated the importance of social protection and education?
Look, it's tough to have a serious social protection and education policy where your default macroeconomic policy is one of austerity. The two don't go together, essentially. And austerity has been the default macroeconomic position of advanced economies since the early 1980s. And so I mean, there's a huge inconsistency there, I think, that persists. I mean, you know, more education is wonderful in both the North and the South, and it's necessary. It's been on the agenda since the early 1990s as the solution to the kinds of inequalities and fragilities that communities have been experiencing since then. It's not a new agenda. The question is why it's not happening. And I think the inconsistency between that kind of policy and the broad economic thrust of a kind of neoliberal agenda, at the end of the day, don't match, right? But the other problem, of course, is that it's not just about governments who do this. You know, firms also used to spend a lot of their profits on training and retraining people. They don't do that anymore, essentially. I mean, take the S&P 500, right? In the course of the last decade, as their profits have increased significantly, I mean, hugely, something like 95% of those profits have been spent either on buying back their own shares or paying out dividends. 95%. So it's an insignificant amount left they have to either reinvest in productive capital, to spend on R&D, or indeed to retrain people. So that's gone out of the window from the side of the enterprise. At the same time, governments have been squeezed on their revenue side because there's been a general decline in taxes, particularly taxes on high wealth individuals and on corporations, which have declined significantly as the share of overall output over this period, as the demands on firms to spend on various social programs, because these are societies that are becoming more insecure, more unequal, more indebted, and there are more demands on the social services of the state, even as their revenue streams are being squeezed. So you've got both on the corporate side and on the state side a set of pressures and forces that, whilst, you know, the language of re-education and training and human-centered is all very nice, but you don't have a set of rules of the game that actually allow that kind of agenda to become a meaningful response to the scale of the problems that people and local communities are facing.
So precisely, if you were to address a message next week to the ministers that are going to attend the ILO conference, what would be your message? And what would be the rules of the game that should be addressed urgently?
Well, I mean, obviously our focus is a little bit more on developing countries. Look, I mean, it's not difficult to deal with. It's not a difficult problem, the inequality challenge, right? If you bump up minimum wages, introduce legislation that makes it easier for trade unions to organize, and impose a progressive taxation system, I can assure you that inequality and insecurity will be significantly decreased. History will prove that combination right every time. The question is that bad for growth and investment and employment generation? The counter argument is that if you follow that kind of route, it's bad for, and I think the evidence actually to the contrary would suggest that, in fact, that kind of agenda is actually good for employment, good for investment, including private investment, and good for productivity growth. I mean, and so that kind of virtuous circle, I think, is actually doable with, and we'll see, I guess. I mean, in a certain extent, the Biden experiment is about that. I mean, all those, not the minimum wage, because he took that off his package, but I mean, all those other ingredients are part of the Biden agenda, and it'll be interesting to watch that play out over the course of the next 2 years, which is the political horizon that the Biden administration is obviously looking at. But, you know, from our understanding of the way in which these things hang together, this is the kind of agenda that can work. It doesn't exclude the importance of education, retraining, and addressing minority and youth problems, which are clearly endemic. But without that kind of different overall macroeconomic approach, I don't think the latter can compensate for the weaknesses of the former.
Do you think that there is a political will to implement what you suggest, both in the North and in the South?
Look, the South faces a very different set of problems because they are hugely fiscally squeezed. I mean, this has been exposed by the COVID-19 crisis. The lack of fiscal space in developing countries has been dramatically exposed during the course of the last 18 months, and that needs to be addressed at the international level with a different kind of multilateral agenda, at least in our opinion. So it's developing countries are not in the same boat, I think, as advanced economies. Yeah, I think one of the things that COVID has once again provided, confirmed, the 08-09 crisis did it, is that the room for expansionary policy is much greater than had been assumed until very recently. Governments just have more spending power than the kind of the simplicities of a neoliberal agenda have led us to believe. Now, there's a whole debate going on about whether this is inflationary and whether there will be problems that come from potential inflationary expectations that some people are predicting as a consequence of these kinds of packages. We don't see that in the work that we do in the Trade and Development Report. But I think the political. The political narrative has changed. Recent comments from, for example, the White House Economic Council are very dramatic in this sense. Yellen has been very clear that the kind of last 30 years of very crude macroeconomics no longer holds. I mean, she said it on numerous occasions. And I think she's right. My problem is I don't think the US example is being followed in Western Europe or in Japan or Australia or in Canada, at least to the same extent. And that's where I think we need to think about a much more aggressive macroeconomic policy and its coordination at the international level.
Mm-hmm. Mrs. Ratcheva, do you agree with what Mr. Kozul-Wright just said? And for you, and for the World Economic Forum, what would be the priority in order to try to convince the political leaders to address those important questions?
Well, in many ways, one of the reasons we haven't had such fantastic dividends from the investments that have been made in education is because this distribution of those investments has not been right. We've seen a stagnation in social mobility, and today more than ever, the situation you're born into is a situation you're likely to find in the future. There's a fundamental lack of investment in making sure that those who have been left behind so far can actually make their way forward. And without someone having the capabilities to go into the labor market and be productive and be able to garner that high wage, it's going to be very hard to convince employers to actually pay that high wage. I think a lot of that growth in wages will be based on the ability, first of all, to bring up the floor. That's basic, and I think that's there. But actually to make sure that we are bringing to the forefront the fact that workers are adding value, they are being productive, they're adding value in combination with technology in some cases. And yes, technology is not going to replace the value that people can add. And I think we've been under the illusion that that can happen in some cases. That's not going to happen. There's still a role for people and a role for technology in labor markets. And if we don't invest in skills, if we don't invest in education, if we don't invest in the quality of that distribution, it's not going to lead us down a virtuous path, irrespective of the kind of bigger picture of what else we do. And that's continued to be one of our fundamental conversations, both with employers who are really feeling the talent crunch. They can't find the workers they need. They can't find the skills that are going to drive us forward. So this is where the macro and the micro are really meeting in a lot of the conversations we're having. But we have to believe that those left behind communities have people who can prosper. And that's something that is a mind shift change. We can't think that some folks can be left behind. We have to think that they have to be brought along on the journey, and they can add value and they can produce that future growth.
Thank you. Mr. Samans, do you think that your next conference, the next ILO conference, will address this very important question? It is to say, to put again human beings and labor at the center of priorities, together with education, together with health. Do you think that the political leaders will understand that, or is it too late?
This is precisely the question that'll be on the table. We've been conducting some informal consultations very intensively for the last couple of months about a potential outcome statement from the conference that makes precisely that point, that in effect there needs to be a reprioritization and rebalancing of priorities in policy, and along with that, what that means for resource allocation, for investment, similar to what our colleague Mr. Kozul-Wright has said before. And so that is really going to be at the center of the debate for the next couple of weeks in the International Labor Conference. And indeed, that many of the people who work in and around the ILO feel that the centenary declaration that was negotiated 2 years ago, which laid out this constructive approach, this human-centered approach to how to contend with the structural challenges of the future of work, whether it be because of technology or the transition to more sustainable economies or demographic shifts, or indeed even some of the geopolitical tensions that have led to some very important ripple effects in supply chains or trading relationships or whatnot. Whatever structural transformation you're talking about here, it does come back to the fact that we need to invest more in our people, in their capabilities, their labor standards and their protections, their remuneration, the safety net underneath them, which is in our terms more social insurance systems and the like. But I would add to that, since given the way you framed today's discussion, you've also added in the international dimension here, the North-South dimension. There will be very considerable discussion about that as well, because these disparities, these disproportionate effects, are not only within countries like this, but also among them. And let me say a word or two about what might be helpful in that regard. I'm speaking here as a participant in your press conference, of course, not necessarily indicating what might come out of a 3,000 or 4,000 person tripartite conference like the ILO will have. But, in some economies, including in the US, as our colleague has pointed out, there has been a decision to what is sometimes called colloquially go big on macroeconomic policy, to really go jusqu'au bout with fiscal monetary policy so as to avert the worst from this crisis from an economic and social perspective. Well, we haven't seen that yet in respect of international cooperation. And I would submit to you and your audience here that this is a moment, if there ever was a moment, since World War II, to go big on international cooperation. And let me give you one or two quick thoughts about what that might mean in practical terms. At the end of the day, this does come down to resources, as our colleague was mentioning earlier when talking about economies and investment. And we have an unprecedented opportunity right now to aid developing countries in a few key respects. One is that there's been an agreement, or a quasi-agreement, it hasn't yet been fully ratified and implemented, to have an extraordinary issuance of international liquidity through the International Monetary Fund's special drawing rights. And those funds, most of which will go to wealthier countries, but who will be in a position, because they don't really need them, to donate them without requiring them to trade off domestic resources at all. They will be in a position to donate them. And this creates a big opportunities to address two of the most acute of crises, really the top two of crises affecting everybody, but particularly developing countries. One is helping developing countries find the resources to be able to vaccinate people and protect them. The WHO has a very important initiative in this area that is largely unfunded. And it could be easily funded through donations of these SDRs. This is the creation of money, in effect. Number one. That would go a long way to averting what is potentially a growing moral debacle right now in the world economy, of this huge disparity between the rate of vaccination and protection of people in wealthier countries like Switzerland and the large majority of humanity who lives in developing countries, where the vaccination campaigns have only really just begun, and in some cases hardly begun at all. Secondly, the climate crisis is the other acute one. It is a slower burning crisis, but it is nonetheless an acute crisis. And this decade is the most important time for action in this regard. And the most important element of addressing that is in replacing and averting new coal-fired production, power generation. And here again, these SDRs provide a unique opportunity to provide some resources that can be applied for something that would benefit all of humanity, and help, and specifically by helping developing countries avert planned coal power generation and to replace existing without additional cost to developing countries who don't have the fiscal space for this. These two uses of those extraordinary issuances of liquidity would go a long way. And then the second and last point, fundamental point I'll make, is that there is enormous untapped capital in the multilateral development banks, international financial institutions, to fund sustainable infrastructure and industry that are in the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals. I consider the Sustainable Development Goals an untapped giant jobs program. And the world needs, particularly developing countries, need productive employment opportunities right now. This would be a win-win. There's been some work done to estimate that these institutions, the multilateral development banks, could increase their direct lending and their risk sharing and syndication capability by $750 billion without affecting their credit ratings in the markets. And Geneva is a town with a lot of private institutional investment. There's about 120 billion plus in private investment out there. An estimated 10% of that is being invested in negative yielding instruments, including here in Switzerland. Another huge chunk is being invested in instruments that earn less than 1%. Well, infrastructure earns typically 10 to 15% historically, and African infrastructure, believe it or not, has lower default rates than in the Western world. So there's a large capital misallocation in the world economy that this would be a way right now of resolving through a smarter use of the existing capital, public capital that's invested in these institutions. Between these two things, better use of our multilateral development banks and the smart application of these new special drawing rights, we could help to really address the huge growing inequalities between the North and the South, and in doing so, really help the world economy, but also live up to our moral obligation.
Thank you very much. Mr. Kozul-Wright, who do you think should take the lead in order to implement what we can say, if I may use the word, revolutionary decisions? Is this the last moment to do it in order to avoid a bigger crisis? And who will take the lead for that?
Yeah, I mean, I would endorse what Richard just said about the opportunities for a fundamental rethinking of the multilateral agenda. I mean, I think we have to admit the multilateral agenda right now is not fit for that purpose. And it's been shown again during COVID-19. I mean, the IMF can say it's got $1 billion of potential resources to lend on. It's lent a fraction of that during COVID-19. On some estimates, it's lent less than it did during the 2008-2009 financial crisis. So, and that's partly because, I mean, not only, but partly because many developing countries don't like the kinds of policy conditionalities that continue to be attached to a lot of multilateral lending, completely inappropriate, in our opinion, policy conditionalities, which have nothing to do with reviving the kind of economic growth strategy and diversifying the economies in the way that we think they need to do, and a lot more to do with ideological fealty. And with the, I mean, the other thing, and this is a ongoing issue for developing countries, of course, is debt relief. You know, and the debt service suspension initiative that was launched under G20 auspices last year is an insignificant. I think they've allocated something like $5 or $6 billion, you know, in countries that are facing hundreds of billion dollars in terms of debt repayments, and many of whom have increased their debt burden as a consequence of the pandemic itself. So you know, the actual commitments that have been made by the multilateral institution have not clearly matched the scale of the problem that developing countries, and that's before we get on to the intellectual property rights question, where vaccine apartheid has been a clear constraint on dealing with the health side of the pandemic. So we do think there's big opportunities. The SDR issuance is particularly welcome. I think, again, you know, Yellen and Biden should be congratulated for that. We argued in the Trade and Development Report last year that we should be seeing something in the order of $1 to $2 trillion to actually begin to meet the financing needs of developing countries. There are all kinds of internal political issues there that I know constrain that. But that's an important advance. How you engineer SDRs to do the kind of long-term financing that we talk about is a more complicated question. It's now being discussed in the IMF and the G20.
Why is it more complicated?
Because they are not money. The point about SDRs is that they're not money, right? They're a financial asset that are held by central banks. So converting, and they're allocated, of course, on the basis of the quota system of the IMF. So as Richard said, the bulk of that goes to those countries with the largest quotas, which are the advanced economies themselves, and getting them to reallocate, which I think is a necessary part of this story, is not as easy, it seems, as we initially had hoped. So there's a lot of issues there with the use of SDRs, not simply as a liquidity mechanism, which they are, but as a financing mechanism for longer term projects. There's a challenge there. We've argued obviously for significant debt relief as a necessary part of that. We've argued one of the missing components of the international financial architecture, which goes back to Bretton Woods, was the failure to create an institution that can deal with sovereign debt problems. There's no institution. The Paris Club does it on a small basis for some developing countries, but it's a creditor-driven organization. The IMF and the World Bank are reluctant to do debt relief. They've done it on an ad hoc basis in the past, but they're reluctant to do it. And anyway, they're creditors as well. We need a specialized mechanism to be able to deal with sovereign debt problems, because they're going to get worse in this decade. And without a shadow of a doubt, if we don't remove the debt burden from many developing countries, we can kiss the Sustainable Development Goals goodbye today, because you cannot generate the kind of resources needed for the investments we're talking about to deliver the SDGs. And we did some calculations in 2019 on this. It's simply not deliverable. Either these countries have to grow at something like 12% a year, or they have to have huge debt relief, and they're not going to grow at 12% a year. So they're going to have debt relief on a significant scale if they're going to generate the resources to meet even the basic SDGs around poverty, education, health, etc. So there's fundamental change. I don't think we can tinker our way out of the kinds of challenges that we're talking about before we get to climate change, where we estimate that an additional 2 to 3% of global GDP is needed in investments to meet the Paris Agreement target. So we need a kind of fundamental rethink of the multilateral system if we are going to be honest about delivering on the SDGs, on the Paris Agreement, etc. And that's a political project. It's not finance is not the big constraint there, as I think you suggested. It's politics, right? It's who, and in a world that has suddenly decided that China is the enemy and that we can't have international cooperation on a meaningful extent with the world's biggest or second biggest emitter and one of the fastest growing economies in the world, we're in trouble, to be quite frank. The West needs to grow up and understand that China is not going away, that it has a right to do the kinds of things it is doing to deliver for its own population. And we need a system that accommodates that and also draws on the resources of China to ensure that we can deliver for countries that are in a far worse situation than they are. I think that's imperative. And I worry particularly about the rhetoric coming out of advanced economies that simply describes China essentially as an enemy in one way or another. They can talk about we can cooperate here or we can cooperate, but essentially China is defined now as a threat rather than an opportunity. And that is a huge mistake when it comes to delivering on the kind of global agenda we're talking about.
Thank you very much. Mrs. Ratcheva, do you share the views of Mr. Kozul-Wright, and especially concerning the debt of the developing countries? Should it be removed? How do you see that?
I'm afraid this is frankly not my specialism enough to comment on it. So I would have to pass on this one. I think both Rick and Mr. Kozul-Wright are much more qualified to speak to this one.
So what would you suggest in order to have a real political will to implement all those measures suggested by the two other panelists?
So what we've actually seen in the past few years is something quite fundamentally, that governments can't take their eyes off their license to operate from their populations. And I would actually return back to my earlier point on actually thinking through social mobility for your local populations, and yes, thinking globally as well. You cannot erode that far the degree in which benefits are distributed so that people turn to more extreme versions of solutions that what is actually quite a sensible and sustainable way forward. We've seen that too many people are left behind, and those people did not do well with their political establishment to date. And then we've seen this extremization in public sentiment. We've seen this change in how people react to their governments and have had to adapt to it. So there is a need to think through how much we need to bring people along with us in these conversations. Yes, we're in Geneva, we're in a fantastic international city, but we cannot forget local populations. And those local populations who are seeing those inequalities in day-to-day life, who are seeing the quality of their lives deteriorate. So there is a paradox in our current moment that we need to think both local and global. We have so much fantastic opportunity to come together to solve global problems, but we do need to carry everyone along with us. Otherwise, as we've seen, we lose political will, we lose momentum, we lose people's desire and initiative to follow through on that bigger global vision that we all know is so fundamentally important.
Thank you very much. J'invite les personnes qui souhaitent poser des questions à nos trois intervenants à lever la main pour qu'on puisse vous voir et vous donner la parole. In the meantime, Mr. Samans, do you think that if this opportunity to change many paradigms is missed, there can be social, I wouldn't say revolution, but more social demonstrations, young people willing to go to the street in order to make their demands understood by the political leaders?
Yes, I think we saw in the last decade or so that inequalities, discrimination, related sets of issues have led to an erosion of social cohesion in quite a number of societies at different levels of economic development. And if the pandemic indeed does leave behind long, deep scars of deepened inequalities in this respect, then I think it's logical to conclude that there'd be likely to have for there to be an extended and expanded social counter-reaction to that. So we're in a very important moment in history, I think, right now, where leadership is required within countries, but also among countries, as we've just been discussing.
Mm-hmm. What do you think, Mr. Kozul-Wright, that, you know, that could be a very important response if what you have suggested is not addressed by the political leaders?
Well, yeah, I mean, clearly that is, you know, all the evidence, for example, from an interwar period was that, you know, the rise of fascism in Europe was ultimately the product of these kind of failed policies that lead to insecurity and inequality. That, I mean, we have that as a horrendous example. I don't think we should be completely pessimistic, though. I mean, if you take the Spanish flu, because everyone's drawing parallels with the Spanish flu of after the end of the First World War, which had hugely devastating consequences on many countries, including in the United States, right? I mean, hundreds of thousands of people lost their lives. There was a huge recession in the early 1920s in the US, but it bounced back incredibly quickly, right? I mean, people talk about the Roaring *20s because growth was so rapid. It ended badly at the end of the day, but there's a set of reasons why the US economy grew so rapidly in the 1920s. So going through the kind of combined health economic shock that we've just seen doesn't necessarily spell gloom and doom in the long term. Doesn't necessarily spell. A lot depends on the kinds of policy and politics that are adopted in response to that. And many of the kind of, I mean, this is another thing. Many of the ideas that we try and promote, you know, people see them as being somehow far out of left field somewhere. You know, we're talking about broad economic aggregates that we saw in Nixon's America, for example, under Richard Nixon. If you look at the kind of figures on wage growth, on investment, on taxation levels, there's nothing tremendously radical about the kind of figures that we're putting forward from a historical perspective and from a relatively recent historical perspective. These are doable numbers if you have the kind of commitments and policies that have been present in modern capitalism in recent decades. So this is not, I think one of the things that kind of really kind of does worry us, and I think Vesselina kind of hinted at this, is that, you know, there is a kind of draining of trust by many people in the political structures of the 21st century. And that's true at both the national and the international levels. And I think addressing that problem of the lack of trust is something that people need to get their heads around very quickly, because it's one of those very intangible qualities about a stable society that once you lose it can be very difficult to regain, but without it, it's very difficult to undertake the kinds of policies that we've been talking about, I think, today. And that is a big challenge, I think, moving forward.
When you mention this is the last moment, is it a matter of weeks, months, in order to avoid what you are afraid of, let's say?
I don't know. David Bowie had a famous song called 5 Years, and I think we've got 10 apparently, don't we, until we've got to deal with this problem. Look, I mean, the climate challenge is a hugely looming problem, and it needs to be tackled urgently. You know, Biden has got some elements of a climate strategy in his new infrastructure package. Not enough, in our opinion, but it's an important move forward. The European Green Deal has components of this in it. You've got countries in like South Korea who have made the Green New Deal part of their formal policy strategy. I mean, there's clearly a move on the notion of green recovery, which we didn't see, for example, after the 2008-2009 financial crisis, where the Copenhagen COP led to a disaster on that front. I don't think, I mean, I think there are positive signs, but I think we definitely need to scale up and move more quickly. If you take the science seriously, the kinds of programs that we've seen so far will not keep temperatures below 1.5 degree above pre-industrial levels, and probably won't keep temperatures below 2 degrees above pre-industrial levels. And that will lead to huge socio-economic damage, particularly in the developing world, you know. So, I mean, there is an urgency here I think, and hopefully maybe the meeting in Glasgow at the end of the year will begin to address.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much. Mrs. Ratcheva, do you also see some positive signs?
Potentially, but it's really not clear right now what people are going to invest in. Truly, are we going to see the kind of investment in the distribution of funding across different populations? Are we going to see a refresh in what children are taught in schools? Are we going to see digitization that will allow the opportunities of education technologies to be realized? We've seen in this pandemic that those who couldn't work remotely were disproportionately those in lower income brackets and in the global south. So are we going to see an investment in that agenda? We don't know yet fully. And one of the aspects of this that will be quite fundamental is defining what good looks like, defining what we are trying to target. Yes, the SDGs, but also the additional aspect of what is that kind of next growth agenda that encompasses digitization, that encompasses education technologies, that encompasses this push to make sure that there is sufficient talent to power us to the next stage, so that it's organic, so that there's this dimension of trust, there's this dimension of being prepared to seize opportunities. And we're probably not there yet in terms of seeing whether this is on the fully on paper. But we should be doing a lot more to actually define what good will look like there, what we expect and what we need in order for it to come through.
Thank you very much. Mr. Samans, what will be the major target of the next ILO conference?
The primary discussion will be about the pandemic and its effect on the world of work, and what I mentioned earlier about the appropriateness and the level of commitment behind accelerating implementation of the Centenary Declaration, which has focused in these areas of policy that can help countries have as broad a base recovery as possible. So this is intended to be, and is likely to be, just given the context we're all living in, the central focus over the next couple of weeks of that conference.
I thank you very much. I thank you, Mrs. Ratcheva. I thank you, Mr. Kozul-Wright. I thank you, Mr. Samans. Je vous remercie, mesdames et messieurs, de nous avoir suivis en direct aujourd'hui pour ce débat très intéressant au Club Suisse de la Presse. Je vous remercie au nom de Pierre Rucci et de tous les membres du Club Suisse de la Presse. We will follow you. We will follow your ILO conference, of course. Merci beaucoup, mesdames et messieurs, d'avoir participé, mesdames et messieurs, d'avoir participé à ce débat. Merci, Tobias, de nous avoir aidés avec les aspects techniques. Je vous remercie et je vous souhaite à toutes et à tous une belle journée. À très bientôt, j'espère. Thank you very much indeed, once again. Thank you. Have a nice day. Bye-bye. Thank you so much.